The Gospel according to Mark, chapter 7, verses 14 through 23. And he called the people to him again and said to them, Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that is going into him that can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, Then you are also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. So, Mark chapter 17, verses 14 through 23. It's a little bit obscure, a little bit weird. It's hard for us to understand as 21st century Christians. But what Jesus here is talking about is he's talking about clean and unclean food, what defiles a person, what doesn't defile a person. Defile is just a word for unclean or sinful, dirty. And to explain this, let me go back a little bit to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there is a ton of laws, right? If you've ever opened the book of Leviticus, you see it's just law after law after law. Deuteronomy, law after law after law. Second half of Exodus, there's law. Like it's just, there's a lot of things that God is doing to teach his people and to make his people his. And one of the things he does is he instills these laws called ceremonial laws. So ceremonial laws, what these laws were things like what you were and were not allowed to eat. And that's the biggest example we'll use here. God put a lot of restrictions around what the people of Israel couldn't eat, because he was like, these foods are unclean, and if you eat them, then you're sinful, and various things. And the purpose of these was it instilled this awareness in the people of Israel and to the Jewish people that they were sinful and God was holy. It just really emphasized the gap between the two, right? Because if they were like, man, even what I eat, I can eat incorrectly, and it shows how big of a gap there is between me and the holy, righteous God of the universe. But Jesus coming, what he does is he, obviously not here yet in Mark chapter 7, but what he's come to do is he's come to bridge the gap between man and God, so that way we can be in community with him. And he does this on something we celebrated just a couple weeks ago on Easter weekend. On Good Friday, specifically, he dies. And he dies for our sin to bridge the gap between us and God. And when he does this, the ceremonial laws actually fulfill their purpose. These ceremonial laws are pointing to our depravity or our sinfulness, our less than God, and how holy God is and how unholy we are. But when Jesus dies on the cross, he shows that gap anyway. He shows us that our sin needed death, it needed sacrifice for us to be made right with God. And so when Jesus died, he closed that gap, right? Instead of here, we were here because Jesus took our sin and he gave us his righteousness, which is just the coolest news. It's amazing. That's why we call it the good news, the greatest news you'll ever hear, because Jesus gave us his righteousness, and that because he did that, the gap is now closed. So we don't need ceremonial laws to show us the gap between us and God anymore, because that gap has been removed. They fulfilled their purpose. They're no longer required. Now, the disciples, they're not going to quite get it yet. There's still some things that happen over the next several books, even in the Acts, and Paul's writings talk about this a little bit. Peter talks about this a little bit. It takes them a while to understand this. But Jesus here is pointing that now that the ceremonial laws are gone, we actually have things far greater to worry about than just the things that come inside our body. Because no matter what you eat, you're going to release at some point, right? Yeah, I know. A poop reference in a video. You're welcome. You're going to release at some point. It's going to come out of your body. That's not what defiles you. That is not what makes you unworthy to be in God's presence. In fact, the thing that makes you unworthy to be in God's presence without the death of Jesus is this giant list that Jesus makes from verses 21 through 22. Evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. Like, he just goes through and rattles off these things. And so far too often, like, we're looking at, we think about like, oh, I better not eat this because then I'll be unclean. I better watch out for what I let come in because that's going to mess me up and maybe ruin my chance because other than that, I do really, really good. And part of me, when I read that, I'm like, that's not my struggle. But it is my struggle. How often do we look around and say the problem is out there? The problem is someone else. If they would just get things right, then I wouldn't be so angry. If they wouldn't frustrate me so much, if they wouldn't be so whatever, then I wouldn't talk about them. I wouldn't gossip. If they're the problem, the government's the problem, our teachers are the problem, our parents are the problem, someone else is the problem. And Jesus here is saying, no, your biggest problem is your heart. Your biggest problem is because from inside your heart comes naturally evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. I'm not going to go through each one of those, but I wanted to read those again. Like, that is really depressing news, knowing that we have all of that evil coming from within us. But thanks be to God that he has made the gap go away. He annihilated it when he came to the cross and he died for our sins and he rose from the dead. He gave us his righteousness. He took our sin and he then made us right with God. And so that list, I challenge you, go through that list and say, what are the things that I struggle with? Now remember, a few of them, like murder, doesn't just mean killing someone. Jesus explains elsewhere that murder in your heart is even just having unrighteous anger at someone, having anger that goes too far at someone. So remember that sexual immorality is not just having sex with someone. That's not your husband or your wife. It's actually even having those thoughts about someone or doing other things with someone that you shouldn't be doing yet. And so these things, this is a very depressing list. But there's hope because we're all sinful. We all have these things within us, but we have really good news that we get forgiven. We've been given grace. We've been given mercy. Grace is just an undeserved gift. And so we have been given these things because Jesus has given us those things. And so whatever you struggle with on this list, whatever you see in your heart as you're examining yourself, know that there is freedom and forgiveness and grace for you. Know that you can pray and say, God, today I look at this list and man, I feel so much envy. Or I've been struggling with sexual thoughts. I'm looking at things I shouldn't look at. I'm struggling with slander. I'm gossiping about people. I'm prideful. I really think highly of myself before I think of others. Lord, forgive me. And just by praying that, just by looking at this list and recognizing that and bringing those to God, God's forgiving you, which is awesome. And he's working on you. It says elsewhere in the Bible that God, what he has started in you, he will finish. And so we're not finished yet. We're still works in progress. So keep praying about these things. Keep bringing them to God and saying, Lord, help me. And he will. I hope this encouraged you, knowing that while we may be defiled on the inside, Jesus makes us clean. He takes our sin and he gives us his righteousness, which again is just the most amazing news. See you next time.